the power of sanctions from the Trump administration. Today, the world expects that Trump might shake up trade worth trillions and tens of trillions of dollars. This could affect European countries, Russia as well, potentially. Not as much as we would like, to be honest, but still. And the threat of direct strikes. The US against Iran, meaning a new war in the Middle East. So these topics are currently the most defining in the information space, and of course concern Ukraine. Especially, for example, an interesting topic that needs to be discussed is that the sanctions imposed by the Treasury, they are now on the US Department of the Treasury's website. So, the sanctions that are now being imposed, they concern including Russian citizens. However, they are now actually being imposed not for Russian aggression against Ukraine, but with a different wording. But here, the threads and chains can lead to accountability for Russian aggression against Ukraine. Thus, the US Treasury has imposed sanctions to counter terrorism, which may include financial or logistical support. Such groups as the Houthis in Yemen, who in turn have ties with Iran and may indirectly cooperate with Russia. These are the Gairat brothers. They, having Afghan origins, hold Russian citizenship and could act as intermediaries in international operations, using their status to circumvent sanctions and supply directly resources, weapons, ammunition, and some money to the Houthis. There are citizens Yuri Bilyakov and Vyacheslav Vidanov who played roles in these schemes. So, this needs to be understood. More details about who these individuals are. Well, for example, Bilyakov. This is an individual associated with activities that have raised concerns in the US in the context of supporting terrorism by circumventing sanctions. Well, and in fact, the data in open sources is limited. It is likely about arms dealers who work directly with Russia, with Iran, and supply weapons to the Houthis. The information is limited, it is not disclosed. It is likely that this is one of the surnames and names of this Bilyakov. Vyacheslav Vidanov is a person associated with activities related to financing terrorism. He is a businessman. Again, there is little information. Sokrap Gairat, a native of Afghanistan, who holds Russian citizenship. He is a graduate of the Moscow State Institute of International Relations and together with his brother Ushang, founded companies that came under sanctions. In fact, it can be said that they may be connected to the official bodies of Russia through private companies, and essentially this could be a cover for the activities of the main intelligence directorate of the General Staff of Russia regarding the supply of weapons to the Middle East. These are in fact the companies and their affiliates being discussed. Why is this directly important? Why does this matter to us? Well, firstly, because Russian citizens are being linked to the financing of terrorism. Well, you might say, what's the big deal? Didn't we already know that Russia is financing? And that Russia itself as a state is terrorism, and it's enough for us to understand and know this, and in general, why aren't these sanctions for the Russian invasion of Ukraine yet? I completely agree with you, but let's think about it together. And what does this mean? The USA is creating chains where it directly links Russian citizens and Russian companies to the supply of weapons and resources to terrorists, Yemeni Houthis, who attack ships in the Gulf of Aden and cause disruptions, directly to one of the largest trade shipping routes in the world, effectively hindering the export of goods from Southeast Asian countries, primarily to Western European countries, but at the same time this disrupts global trade chains. And this is linked to Russia. The USA, I want to remind you, started strikes on Yemeni Houthis in March, targeting their positions, and continue to do so. And in fact, this formed the basis of the scandal that everyone knows about, the group in Signal, a chat that was likely created by President Trump's national security advisor Michael Wolff, where the correspondence took place, and data regarding strikes directly on Houthi positions and so on. That is, all of this was and is being done. A connection that is a direct link. The Russia-Iran-Yemen Houthi connection. who receive weapons, who receive funding. That is, Russia today is effectively supporting direct enemies of the USA who threaten Americans with destruction and report that they are supposedly attacking American aircraft carriers and other targets. In other words, they are effectively direct enemies of the USA. We have a connection here. And here, Russia is sent a corresponding signal, in my opinion, which is as follows. This is a hint about what is happening now. Such escalation and the next sanctions could be more powerful and directly applied against Russia. But this connection to Iran, if it is correctly interpreted, including by the American media, just as I am saying now, it is an exposure of Russian presence to the support of the enemies of the United States of America, which should only be interpreted this way. There simply cannot be any other interpretations of this situation as of today. So what? Accordingly, now the USA and Iran are on the brink of a major war. Because as the British publication Mail claims, the United States has prepared everything. Everything is in combat readiness today to be ready at any moment. The American aviation is ready to take off and deliver powerful strikes on Iranian military targets and on facilities directly involved in Iran's nuclear program, which can enrich uranium for the purpose of creating their own nuclear weapons. This clearly indicates and suggests that there could be a significant confrontation there now. Iran is not making concessions, and Russia continues to support the Houthis and Iranians. Of course, now all these tensions will be addressed by Putin's special envoy, Kirill Dmitriev, who will visit the United States. He will have a meeting with the US Special Envoy on Middle Eastern issues, who also deals with matters concerning Russia, Steve Witkoff, and they will be discussing these topics. The nature of the visit is somewhat different. What is the purpose of Dmitriev's trip? The purpose of Dmitriev's trip is to try to divert the focus of US media attention away from the fact that Trump is irritated by Putin dragging out the process and unwilling to establish a ceasefire, now, which the global media have started to write about more actively. And there is an attempt to divert attention towards the notion that Ukraine is not a reliable partner and does not want to quickly conclude an agreement on access, development, and extraction of minerals and rare earth elements. They claim that Russia is ready for this, so let's cooperate together. Well, that's the Kremlin's calculation. Overall, Russia's current calculation is to take any possible measures to drive a wedge in the strategic relations between Ukraine and the USA, to portray Ukraine as supposedly unable to negotiate. This is Russia's goal, and therefore they will use various elements, including Dmitriev's visit, to the fullest extent for implementation, specifically these mentioned goals. Well, we also need to... This includes understanding it, and it must not be allowed. Of course, other topics may be raised during these negotiations, but the intrigue today is what sanctions Trump will impose on Europe and then tariffs. Because, as noted by Bloomberg, the imposition of the harshest tariffs in 100 years will affect global trade worth 33 annual trillion US dollars. Quite a sum, isn't it? And countries with a high trade surplus, trade with the US, such as Japan, China, Brazil, the EU, could lose from 4 to 90% of their exports to America. If these countries act reciprocally and impose tariffs on the US, well, of course it will be just a disaster in trade and the economy, because who will the Americans sell to then, and what do they have to sell? Well, actually, there are a lot of questions. These are truly revolutionary. There could be restrictions. Will there be restrictions? Hellish sanctions against Russia, which could be imposed because Putin is essentially not fulfilling the agreements reached in Saudi Arabia with the Americans to at least cease fire and continue the peace process regarding Ukraine. This remains an intrigue. But for some reason, I think that the wait won't be long. Take care of yourself. Glory to Ukraine.